This is the Money Hour with your host, Tina Mitchell, on Alternative Talk, AM 1150. Now, back to the show with local mortgage and finance expert, Tina Mitchell.
Welcome back to the Money Hour with your host and mortgage expert, Tina Mitchell, right here on 1150 AM KKNW, the Saturday, September 27th show. Each week I share expert advice and inside knowledge on how today's events and our local economy can affect your money. If you're hearing my show at a different time or day, you're listening to a rebroadcast. To talk with me or any of the guests that I have in studio today, you can call into the show at 1-855 400-1150. Again, that's 1-855-400-1150 or online at themoneyhour.com. And in studio right now, Doug Phillips, owner of Phillips Estate Law. Doug, excited to have you in studio and talk a little bit about estate and taxes. And thanks for coming back.
Thank you, Tina. I'm excited to be here.
A little bit about Doug. Doug is the owner of Phillips Estate Law, and he received a BA in economics in Willamette University with honors and his Juris Doctor from UW. Before starting his own law practice in 2003, he spent 5 years in the estate planning group at Bogle Gates in Seattle, a large international law firm. He has more than 10 years chairing the estate planning department in Inslee, Best, Doezie Ryder at the Bellevue law firm, so it must be down the street from my office. And Doug's a regular speaker on estate planning and tax issues and at continuing legal education seminars, and has presented estate planning seminars at local companies such as Boeing. Doug, again, it's nice to have you back in studio. And this is a really important topic, and I think a lot of times, my first guest in studio, Janice, which is another regular contributor to the show in the financial planning arena, people think more about their financial planning, and in the wealth team that you need to have behind you to protect you. I'm not really sure why, but I think estate planning falls in that backup plan, which I think it needs to be right up there in the front of the plan, and to make sure that you're protected there. So lots of information and great advice that Doug can share with you. But today we're going to talk about estate taxes. So what is an estate tax? Can you explain that to my listeners?
Yes, the estate tax is a tax on a wealth transfer.
Okay.
So people make gifts of wealth during their lifetime, but usually at their death through a will or a beneficiary designation. And so if the transfer of wealth is to somebody who is not a spouse or a charitable organization, there is a tax on that transfer of wealth based upon the size of the transfer. However, there are, as we'll talk about in a minute, there are some amounts that you can pass tax-free. But if you pass above a certain threshold, there'll be an estate tax or a tax on the transfer of the wealth.
So, Doug, estate tax was in the news a lot in 2012. Why was that? What happened?
Well, this was at the federal level. So the federal, as we'll talk about in a minute, there's a state of Washington has its own estate tax, but we primarily think of the federal estate tax. And in 2012, there were a lot of changes that were pending, and then which was really dealing with the amount of wealth that could be passed tax-free.
Okay.
So in 2012, the amount that one could pass tax-free was $5.1 million. And we all heard a lot about the cliff that was coming.
Yes, the financial fiscal cliff. And what happened with that fiscal cliff? But anyways, whole nother.
Well, on the estate tax side, on the income tax side, they actually raised income taxes. On the estate tax side, what they did is actually decrease taxes. But the risk, if that law had not been passed, was that they would have dramatically reduced the amount that a person can pass tax-free down to about $1.4 million from $5.1. So it was a pretty dramatic drop. So we had some of our wealthier clients who were hurriedly making large gifts under the regime in place in 2012 for fear that they would not have the opportunity after that. Now, of course, what did in fact happen as of the bill passed on January 2nd of 2013 is they actually raised the exclusion from 5.1 to 5.25 million and then indexed it to inflation. So it actually was kind of much ado about nothing on the estate tax side.
Yeah, there was a lot of that with the fiscal cliff. I can't remember how many times I was talking in studio about what was, the potential of what's coming up, but that's why we need that crystal ball. So, Doug, let's talk about, since we are in Washington State, what is the difference between Washington State and federal estate tax?
Yeah, so the state of Washington has an independent estate tax system. It's one of only 20 states that do.
Okay.
And the systems work for the most part the same, meaning that you can pass to your spouse, as long as your spouse is a U.S. citizen, you can pass any amount tax-free. and you can pass any amount tax-free to a charity. So it's when you pass to your children, your grandchildren, other family members that we worry about the estate tax. So that's similar between Washington State and the federal government. The first big difference between the two systems, though, is that Washington State only allows you to protect $2 million from state estate tax.
Okay,
so
wow.
This so-called exemption or exclusion amount is now $2 million. It's actually indexed to inflation in Washington State beginning this year. So the technical exclusion this year is $2,012,000, and that will go up again with inflation every year thereafter. Whereas the federal government now allows you this year, because it's also indexed to inflation, to shelter $5.34 million, and that again will rise with inflation as well. So it's a very big disparity between the two amounts that you can pass tax-free. So that's the first striking difference. The second difference is the federal estate tax rate, once you get over the exclusion amount of $5 million or so, is a flat 40%.
Okay.
The state of Washington starts much lower, but it's progressive. So the first dollar over $2 million is going to be taxed only at 10%.
Okay.
And there's about $1 million bands. So you go above $3 million, you jump into the 14% bracket.
Yep.
You go above $4 million, you jump into the 15% bracket. And you quickly, in $1 million bands, get up to 20% for clients who have a very high net worth of $11 million or more.
So you just want to strategically think how much what your estate taxes or what your estate's worth and where you want to live.
Exactly. So I've actually had a client move out of state to avoid state estate tax. Although the other kind of last big difference between the two systems, and one that makes the Washington state estate tax not so daunting, is that we have no gift tax in Washington. And what that means is lifetime gifts are not taxed.
Okay.
So if you die and own assets and pass them through your will or beneficiary designation of an IRA or life insurance policy, there will be a tax if you have more than $2 million that you're passing to family members. However, if you make a gift literally on your deathbed of any amount, Washington State does not recognize the transfer. So there will be literally no tax on that. So we are now structuring clients' estate plans to position them to be able to make deathbed gifts should the need arise. Now, the good news is that most of us live to a ripe old age and die, and we don't normally die suddenly, which means that for most people, you have some forewarning and some ability to structure your affairs for tax reduction. So one thing that we're doing is making sure that people's estate plans contemplate this possibility of a gift before death, but especially when they're older. And then you have a problem about what happens if the person becomes incapacitated and can't make a gift, and then we know that their death is imminent. Well, if you have a really well-drafted, and by that I mean probably a new financial power of attorney that liberally authorizes gifts that comply with their overall estate plan, you can have what's called your attorney in fact make the gift for you under the power of attorney. The problem is that most financial powers of attorney don't authorize that.
Okay.
So that's one thing to look into if you have a net worth of above $2 million.
Got it. So it really just, again, I can't encourage enough as your host here of the Money Hour, and I called it the Money Hour because it's really regarding anything and protecting your money and to make sure that we're having as much of it that we can to enjoy life and to be able to leave behind to our family and our children. And that's why it's so important with estate planning is it's not about procrastination. It's about figuring out where you're at right now and getting that plan set up. So Doug, what about the estate tax exclusion?
Yeah, so this is what I was alluding to before. So this is the amount that someone can pass, an individual person can pass free of estate tax to somebody, even if they're not a spouse and not a charity. Okay. So let's say I'm single and in fact, in my case, I do have 4 children. I could pass under Washington state law up to $2 million or $2,012,000 tax-free. That's the exclusion amount, or a state tax exclusion. Okay. Under the federal rules, I could pass up to, like I said, $5.3 million tax-free. So that's the exclusion amount. So just because I'm giving assets to children, that doesn't mean there's going to be a tax. So if I die, and again, if I'm single and I die and I pass all my assets to my children, and I'm worth $1.9 million, there will be no state or federal estate tax. Okay. However, if I'm worth $3 million, then there'll be no federal estate tax because I'm under the federal exclusion amount of 5.3, but I've exceeded now the Washington state exclusion of $2 million. So there's going to be a tax on that excess $1 million. And as I said before, that would be a 10% tax rate. Yep. So it would be approximately a $100,000 tax bill owing to the state of Washington.
Got it. Which $100,000 is a big tax bill.
It's real money.
Yeah, it's real money. So can I pass to my husband my exclusion?
Yes, you can. And this is a new rule under the federal law, which what I mean by that is that if I die and I'm married, my spouse, my surviving, in my case, my wife, she can, after my death, file a federal estate tax return and claim my unused exclusion. So if I've made no major gifts during my lifetime, then I have my full $5.3 million federal exclusion still available. And this often comes under the heading of portability. In other words, my exclusion amount is portable to my wife. It can be transferred to her, but she must claim it by filing a federal estate tax return.
Okay.
Now, this can be done no matter what my net worth is, which is a little bit strange if you think about it for a minute. But in any case, let's say my wife's and my net worth, we're done well, we're worth $5 million. So if I give everything to my wife, so she ends up with the full $5 million, then and we maybe have some concern that before she dies, she's going to be worth substantially more than that, and that excess might be exposed to estate tax. So at my death, she can file a federal estate tax return through this portability concept, claim my unused exclusion, and she now has about a $10.6 million exclusion that she can use going forward.
Okay. So if somebody's listening right now, one of my listeners, and getting this information going, you know what, I don't have an estate tax problem. What other assets could they be missing? Yeah,
what people often don't understand is, number one, their retirement plan benefits are fully subject to federal estate tax. So their IRAs, 401ks,
really?
all of that is subject to federal.
Well, Janice is shaking her head. Yeah, she knew that.
Federal and of course she did. To federal and state estate tax, they think, they just think about the income tax side of it. So yes, even your retirement plans are subject to estate tax, but so is the death benefit of your life insurance. And what a lot of people say in response, and when I tell them that, they say, well, I thought life insurance is tax-free. And I say, well, it is from income tax. Yeah. It is not from estate tax. So if I die with a very large life insurance policy and the payable to my children, then I may have created a taxable estate, not through maybe my earnings that I've accumulated in my house or my retirement plan. Maybe I have $2 or $3 million or more of life insurance death benefit, and that's all counted as a hard asset.
Wow.
So you total up the death benefit, your retirement plan. So
somebody's listening, $5 million seems like a lot, but really it's not if you're leaving that out of your calculation.
Yes.
Wow. So Doug, what can my listeners do to reduce their estate tax exposure?
Well, there's a number of things. We start with basic planning assuming, again, you're married for a second.
Okay.
So a husband and wife. One of the concerns is that if I'm just going to pick on the husband here and say he dies and gives everything to his wife, which is very common. If he just gives everything outright to her, we know there's no estate tax there immediately because of that marital deduction I talked about. But now the wife has all the assets, right? Now we know that on the federal side, she can claim his unused exclusion, and maybe that's not a problem. But there's no such concept under state law. There's no portability for the Washington state exclusion. So normally you're going to create in their wills, if they have this kind of net worth, you're going to create under the husband's will a trust for his share of the assets to pass into, and his wife is the beneficiary of all those assets for the rest of her life, and usually the trustee who controls it as well.
Okay.
So she really has all the functional control and financial benefit of the assets. But when she dies, because the assets did not go to her directly, they're in the trust instead. They will pass, again, if they were under the $2 million figure going into the trust, even if they've grown, they will pass out of the trust to the children at the second death free of estate tax. So that's just,
got it.
Some people call this bypass trust planning, credit shelter trust planning. There's various names given to it, but the idea is just to preserve both spouses' exclusion. So that's kind of where we start. I've also mentioned this idea for Washington State making lifetime gifts. Again, this is typically more of a single person who's elderly and maybe or ill, and we think their end of life is near. So we can make lifetime gifts and avoid estate tax that way. On the federal side as well, they do count lifetime gifts when you make transfers, but they don't count the first $14,000 you give every year.
Okay.
So if I'm a high net worth person, I'm worried even about federal estate tax, and I have several children, I can give each of them $14,000 a year. It's not income to them, and it doesn't even count against my $5.3 million exclusion. So I can just do that every year. And if I have a long life I live a long time, I can pass a lot of money away tax free. You can also do things like change the ownership of your life insurance policy. You can have your life insurance policy owned by a trust.
Yeah.
And the beneficiaries that you want to benefit from the death benefit will be beneficiaries of that trust, like your spouse or your children. And if you transfer ownership of the policy if either you have the trust buy the policy initially, or you gift a policy to the trust that you currently own and live another 3 years past that, then the death benefit's no longer part of your taxable estate. So those are very tried and true things that we do to reduce estate taxes. And of course, there's many more, but I know we don't have time.
Of course there is. And that's what radio really is about. It's an hour show. It's about just giving you some things to think about. And it's okay if we're leaving the listeners wanting a little more, because there's not enough time to go over every special circumstances. And it's really just hearing something and realizing, you know what, I need to get on the phone. I need to talk to an expert. And that's really what the show's about. 1-855-400-1150. Again, that's 1-855-400-1150, or online at the Money Hour. Just type in Doug's name and you will find his segments that I've had in studio with him, and he'd be happy to assist and help with any of you being a listener to the show. Doug, thank you so much for coming back into studio. Excited to have you back in again. I got a list of questions that I want to ask you. We'll have to do that next time.
Thanks again.
Coming up next in the Money Hour, urban infill and urban development in Washington State. Don Hines with Real Property Associates right here on 1150 AM KKNW after the short break.